taxes under an income tax than they currently do. Everybody to the right of the red line ended up paying more taxes, and these are for our resident homeowners would pay more. But keep in mind, this chart was based on assuming we needed to generate $1 million in additional revenue, so we were only decreasing the millage rate by 3.2 mils. As we look at what kind of revenue we really need now that we know more about personal property tax, one could make the argument that we could actually reduce the millage rate by more than 3.2 mils and still be able to provide the services we're providing. And as we do that, what would happen is that red line would shift to the right of this chart. I didn't go through and recalculate for everybody. I certainly can do that to know where that line would certainly be. But what would happen is that red line would shift to the right, so there would be more of our resident homeowners that would see less taxes under an income tax than are on the right-hand side of that line. So one of the things I'm going to talk to you about later is if we want to move forward with this, we should come to some agreement on what we want that net revenue to be so that we can redo this chart for you to show you where that line really is. One of the other questions we got is how many people are in each of those boxes? Do we know how many people would save that $70 that's in the second box on the second line? And we don't, because we don't know what the income is of every homeowner. But what we were able to do, and you can't really see this on the slide, so I've attached it to the back of your handout. And let me get to it so that this is what your handout looks like, and I don't expect you to be able to read this on the screen, and I apologize to the people at home. But down the left-hand side of the chart, what we did is we took the taxable values of all of our residential units in the city of Mount Pleasant and did a frequency distribution for you to show you that 14% of our parcels in the city have a taxable value somewhere between $0 and $30,000. Obviously, they're not at zero. It really should be between $1 and $30,000. Another 16% of those parcels have a value between $30,000 and $40,000. So as you go down the chart horizontally, you can see that approximately 50% of our residential parcels in the city of Mount Pleasant have a taxable value of $50,000 or less. So they're in those top three lines of the chart horizontally. When we started looking at incomes, what we were able to do was get some information out of the 2010 census data. And that census data tells us the household income. So it's not necessarily taxable income, but at least it gives you an idea of income. So we tried to do the same thing going across the columns of the chart to say what percentage of people are in each of those columns, and did a frequency distribution. Unfortunately, the way that the census grouped the incomes was slightly different than how we did it with every $5,000, so we kind of had to group them. But again, you can see if you look along the top part of that, if you look at a household income between $0 and $25,000, that's 50% of our households according to the census data. I think that's maybe a little inflated, and the reason for that is we had so many students that were counted in our census data that a student was counted as a household because the census didn't differentiate, do you own a home or don't you? They just took the households and looked at income. So those numbers along the top, I got to tell you, I wouldn't put a lot of weight in because it's really looking at things differently than what an individual person doing this chart would do, but it's the best we had to share with you to try to give you some idea of how that distribution might look. So we wanted to share it, but like I said, I'm real confident horizontally. As you go across this way, I'm a little less confident that you can draw good conclusions based on that. Does that make sense before I go on? Okay. One of the other things the consultant provided for us is an individual calculator that an individual could go in and fill out information about themselves to know if they as an individual are better off under an income tax scenario or under a millage rate scenario. And again, I don't expect you to be able to read this on the screen, but we added another couple boxes to that chart to show not only are you better off under an income tax or a millage rate, what's the impact of that to know what page 7 looks like for you, but then we took it the next step to say, what if we did option number 2 instead, and we said we want to make up our revenue loss only with a millage increase? What would that do to homeowners? So the bottom right 2 boxes would calculate for an individual homeowner what their tax bill would likely go up if you chose option 2 to make up the revenue loss. But again, we need to come to some agreement on what that revenue loss is for this to calculate appropriately. But once we have those discussions, if you want to move down that road, we could make this calculator available on our website so that individual homeowners in our community could pull out their 2012 tax return, which I'm sure they're working on right now. They could fill in those green boxes. They could pull out their assessment notice that they get from the assessor's office in February, fill out the top green box, and they would know whether they're going to pay more taxes under an income tax or less taxes under an income tax scenario by just filling out those 8 or 10 green boxes, most of which come off their tax return. So we could easily make this available so people can start to understand the impact to them as individuals. I think I said all of this stuff. The important part on this slide is before we make that available, I think we have to have some agreement on what our revenue target is, because not only does that drastically affect that chart on slides on page 7, but it also drastically changes those calculations. So what new information do we have about 2013 that we didn't have a year ago when we first started talking about this? Certainly we know a little bit more about personal property tax. We don't know a lot more, unfortunately. We know that the legislature passed the bills in December to eliminate industrial personal property tax, and we know that they passed bills that will provide a replacement mechanism for some portions of that personal property tax. What we don't know is exactly what all of those mean. We've heard that there's probably 15 to 20 bills that are going to be introduced in the next couple months to clarify and give better guidance on what some of those things mean. But as importantly is that whole replacement mechanism is dependent on a statewide vote in August of 2014 about how a use tax that the state has would be allocated. And if that vote in 2014 doesn't pass, then all of the bills are repealed and we're back to square one. So even though we're starting to get more clarity on what replacement might look like, it's still contingent on that vote that is over a year away. So we're really not much more certain about what personal property tax may mean for us in the long run. We certainly know in 2013 we're safe, but we don't know for 2014 or for future years. The conventional wisdom I've heard from other people in local government is they're working under a best case scenario assumption that they will only lose 20% of their personal property tax revenue, which for us is $120,000. So if the bills all went through, if that vote passed, we would probably lose $120,000 out of our $600,000 that we currently get. The other piece we know is, as we told you in December when you approved the amended budget, our surplus savings account is going to be a little bit higher than what we had first projected it to be. So at the end of 2013, because we're not going to lose personal property tax as we had first thought, and because we've got a little bit more in that projected surplus savings account, we have you have $400,000 more of flexibility than what you first thought you had when you approved the 2013 budget. So it gives us a little bit more time to kind of work through this and decide. What are the next steps? If you were to decide, and the consultant had this in his presentation, if you were to decide you wanted to move forward with the potential of an income tax, we would have to have an ordinance drafted for you that you would have to approve. And then that ordinance goes to a citywide vote for the voters to decide upon. If you wanted to have a vote in May, you'll know that the state only lets us have elections 4 times a year. The next one is in May. So if you wanted to have a May vote, you would have to have the language of that ordinance approved by the majority of you by mid-February. We're getting kind of tight there. Probably can't make that one. Yeah, we could. Actually, I think the date's February 26th is the true drop-dead date. So you could make it, but it'd be tough. Actually, I don't think you could because you have to have a public hearing first. So we can't make that one. If you wanted to have an August vote, we would have to have that language done by mid-May. So that one's certainly doable. And that would allow us to implement it in January 2014. If you wanted to have a November vote, the language would have to be done by mid-August, but that would mean we couldn't implement until January of 2015. So that kind of gives you an idea of the timeline we need to work under if you decide you want to continue to go down this road of potentially a new revenue source. So that's the summary of the last 12 months in about 10 minutes or less. Maybe it was 15 minutes. I talked a little bit slower tonight.
20 minutes, 19 seconds.
Oh, geez, I talked really slow. Must be, I apologize for that. So our next steps are to answer any questions you have or give you any clarifications you might need. And then at some point in the near future, you need to come to some agreement on direction to the staff on whether you want to pursue this potential revenue source or not. So with that, I'll turn it over to you to see if you have any comments or questions.
And I would remind you that we're scheduled to talk about this again at your retreat on Wednesday evening. And so it was important for us to get you up to this speed again this evening so you'd be fresh and ready to go for Wednesday.
So with that in mind, are there any questions or clarifications? Commissioner Joslin.
Just one quick question. If it was an August vote, it would be implemented in 2014?
Yes, we believe we could do that.
Okay, thank you.
Now, certainly you could have an August vote for a 2015 implementation if you wanted to. You get to pick the date, but the soonest we could do it, it always has to be a January, and the soonest obviously would be January 2014, but you could pick a later date for it to be effective.
Any other questions? I did appreciate, I thought that the page you have at the end, but making some effort to try to indicate how many households we have in various categories is probably the best we could do, and I appreciate it because I think it is helpful. Although I would agree with you, the 50% probably does reflect a lot of changing population, but nonetheless, I really, that's more than I expected that we would be able to get, so I really appreciated that. And I assume that at the retreat, part of what we will be talking about will be reassessing our revenue need, what we view as being the shortfall in revenue, and therefore what the size would need to be and how much we might be able to drop the millage. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, I know we don't know, it seems like we don't know a lot of what's going on in the state, you know, what kind of money we might be getting for them, but what are you estimating that the structural deficit will be this year?
For 2013, it will be $200,000. The budget that was approved assumes $200,000 of that structural deficit for 2013.
Okay.
Anything else? All right, thank you very much, Ms. Ridley. And as the city manager pointed out, we will be meeting again at 5 o'clock on Wednesday. And just a friendly reminder for those of you who are perhaps still working on your evaluations, I won't mention any names yet. It would be very helpful to receive those sometime in the next perhaps week or so. Okay, if nothing else, meeting is adjourned.
I gotta make a note, I'll never remember.
Very, very helpful.